It's very clear that Nietzsche regards the spiritual health of most people as having nothing to do with self-actualization. In fact, he's a great advocate of self-mortification when you get right down to it. Nietzsche, in one of his most beautiful books, which he wrote the last year of his life, last year of his working life, it's called Twilight of the Idols, and in there he talks about how every culture is like a pyramid, and the heights of culture are very small and narrow, and they rise upon the foundation of a broad, low base of solidly packed mediocrity. And his attitude is that the fate of most people is to be this solidly packed basis of mediocrity above which the peak will rise. And he thinks that that's good for them. That's as good as most people are going to get, to take part in civilization or culture and be subjected to its discipline, which means to be subjected to whatever it considers sacred, to its God and its values. Now let's take a look at a passage here. This is on page 234 at the bottom where it says 356. This is section 356 from his book. It's called How Things Will Get More and More Artistic, in quotes, in Europe. The need to make a living still forces upon nearly all male Europeans a role. I guess he didn't realize that it's now forcing itself upon most female Europeans, too. Their so-called profession. Even today, in our time of transition, when so much is ceasing to force things upon us, some retain the freedom and apparent freedom to choose this role, their profession, themselves. Most have it chosen for them. The result is strange enough. Nearly all Europeans confuse themselves with their role when they reach a more advanced age. They themselves are the victims of their good acting. They themselves have forgotten to what extent chance, moods, and whims controlled them when their profession was decided, and how many other roles they perhaps could have played. For now it is too late. Viewed more deeply, the role has really become character, and art nature. Art becomes nature. The role becomes character, art becomes nature. Now this sounds like a lament, right? People have this persona, this mask, the businessman, right, or the society hostess, or whatever thing one ends up being. And by performing this role for a long enough time, they become it. They lose their freedom. By acting a certain way, they become a certain thing. And they don't recognize that they could be other things. They have other potentialities, and their freedom is restricted and constricted, and that sounds like a terrible thing. Well, for some people that really would be terrible. But Nietzsche doesn't think that this is a terrible tragedy for most people. In fact, the tragic thing for him is not that people have personas and become personas, but that they realize this at some part in their life and become discontented with the lot that they have to play. That's the real tragedy. And so he goes on to laud the Middle Ages. There have been ages in which one believed with solid confidence, in fact with piety, that one was predestined for precisely this business, precisely this way of earning one's bread, and simply did not want to recognize the element of chance, role, arbitrariness. Classes, guilds, and hereditary trade privileges brought about, with the help of this belief, those enormous social hierarchies that characterize the Middle Ages, and which one has to credit with one thing at least, durability. And duration is, on earth, a value of the highest rank. So what he's saying is that in more traditional societies, the mediocre people are more solidly packed together, and you have a more durable structure. Why? Because they have less self-awareness of the difference between their person and their persona, the mask that they wear. And so they're less discontented with themselves. So what he's really saying is that most people are more contented the less self-conscious they are, the less aware of what society has made them into, and how different that is from what they themselves could have made themselves into. This is interesting. He thinks that for most people, self-awareness is just a source of discontentment, and that the stupider you are, the happier you are. Ignorance really is bliss for the majority of human beings. And he thinks that the majority of human beings only attain a certain nobility and worth by being bricks in a larger edifice, namely the edifice of a civilization, and being subordinated to the discipline of its values and culture. And if you turn to page 236, you find this very clear. He says, "For that basic faith is dying out on which one can count in that way, the faith on which on the basis of which one can make promises, anticipate the future in a plan, sacrifice the future to one's plan, namely the faith that human beings have value, have meaning only insofar as they are stones in a great construction, for which purpose they must first of all be stable stones, and above all not actors, not people who realize that they're acting, but people who just act, who identify themselves with their role entirely and have no ironical or self-conscious distance from the role that they play in society. Briefly put, it will still be kept silent long enough. You know, saying I can say this public and no one's going to know it. That's you don't have to hide anything in this world because people pass right by it anyway. But from now on will no longer be constructed, no longer can be constructed as a society in the old sense of the word. We are lacking everything to build this construction, above all the material. None of us is material for a society anymore. There's a truth that is timely. It makes no difference to me that meanwhile the most short-sighted, perhaps the most honest, in any case the noisiest kind of human being that there is today, our friends the socialists, believe, hope for, dream, and above all scream and scribble roughly the opposite. For one can really read their watchword for the future of free society on every table and wall. Free society? Yes, yes. But you know, gentlemen, don't you, that such a thing, what such a thing is built of? Wooden iron. The famous wooden iron. And this wooden iron isn't even wooden. Now, wooden iron in German is just a kind of idiomatic phrase for something that can't exist. It's a self-contradiction. A free society, he's saying, is a self-contradiction. You can't have civilization if everybody is free. Why? Because civilization requires hierarchy, order, stability. It requires, again, the broad, solidly packed base of mediocrity above which the peaks of civilization can rise. If every one of those little stones decides it's got to be itself and be a free spirit, the whole structure collapses and flattens out, and we get modern consumer society, where everything is pretty much the same. And even all the things that were considered high and holy, well, you can order them from a catalog now. There's no sense of the unity of cultures anymore, or the unity of styles. We have this kind of postmodern eclecticism and playfulness. Nothing is serious anymore, everything is playful. Put it this way, everything can be ordered from a catalog. Cultures have been reduced to simply consumer goods that you can mix and match, right? You can go and get your hair done in dreadlocks if you want, and no one realizes that dreadlocks mean something, or used to mean something, and that some white guy in Atlanta shouldn't be wearing them. You know, in the original context, these things had certain meanings. They have no more meanings anymore. You can buy them if you want. Anybody can, just the right amount of money. You interested in Tibet? Well, you can buy some little Buddhas and some things from little shops and put them on your mantelpiece. And 3 weeks later, if you're interested in something else, you decide you're no longer a Buddhist. You know, you like Medina Monsoon is sort of an on-again, off-again Buddhist. She starts chanting at one point, and her friend says, "Are you still doing that?" And she says, "Almost religiously." Well, you can be born again, or become Jewish, or whatever, which means buying new knickknacks, trying to fit them together in a kind of interesting, eclectic style. And nothing really has any purchase on us deeply. A person who really believes in something can never mix and match a style, you know, or cultures. A person who's really a participant of a certain culture. A real Turk doesn't have a Christmas tree. But the thing is that to really believe something is to participate in it and not to have a distance from it, to take it seriously. Whereas people who don't believe things always have a kind of ironic distance from it. They don't take it so seriously that say, being a Jew doesn't exclude celebrating Christmas. And so this is the direction that Nietzsche thinks everything is moving in, because everyone wants to be a free spirit, a rolling stone. And the difference between high and low, sacred and profane, serious and frivolous, all these distinctions have been erased. And this is very bad for us as human beings. And so his attitude is that we need to create a new civilization. Well, how do you do that? Well, he recommends self-actualization. Well, why? You know, that seems to be recommending the very disease as its cure. Nietzsche's cure for modern nihilism is homeopathic, meaning that he wants to cure modern nihilism with more nihilism. Why? Well, his attitude, I'm going to write a book someday, which I'm sure real scholars will scoff at, but I want to write a book with the title something like, How Nietzsche Destroyed Western Civilization and Why He Did It. Because Nietzsche's ethics of self-actualization really seems to be in some ways regarded by him as a kind of homeopathic treatment for modern nihilism. In his book, Twilight of the Idols, he has a little section called Whispered to Conservatives. Nietzsche was very much a cultural conservative, but at the same time, he recognized that nothing goes backwards, everything goes forward. And he says, so if something is rotten, you can't unrot it, you can't restore it. You simply have to push it over, destroy it as quickly as possible, and get on to something new. And I think in some ways Nietzsche's ethical teachings, especially the ones that have been popularized and received in our culture with such fervor, are precisely designed to be received in our culture to speed up its own process of destruction. And this is why he treats nihilism with more nihilism, encourages the wheel along. He says you can't walk backwards like crabs. You have to go deeper, deeper into decadence. Why? Because once you go deep enough, everything dissolves. And we lose our sophistication, we become barbarians again, and barbarians believe things. And from the ashes of one civilization rises a new barbarism. There's a new openness to sacredness and the transcendent, and there are new gods appear, and new values, new cultures, and so forth. That seems to be his great hope. But at the same time, he does seem to think that there are some people who need to hear this teaching of self-actualization. Not because it'll make things worse, because for them it'll make things better. And these are precisely the people he thinks are to be the ones who impose, in some way, new tables of values and judgments. And as it turns out, even the term self-actualization is really wrong, because that presupposes some kind of prior notion of the self that becomes actual, that's virtual and then becomes actual. And for Nietzsche, that's not the case. In itself, the self is nothing in particular. What happens is we create a self. We create a self out of a kind of indeterminate stuff. And this is why, for instance, in the very beginning of the reading, he talks about how, she says, only as creators, this has given me the greatest difficulty and goes on being my greatest difficulty, to recognize that unspeakably more depends on what things are called than on what they are. He's saying that names are more important than substance. Why? Well, because things, by being given a certain name, become something. At the end of that little section, at the top of page 228, these last three lines, only as creators can we destroy. But we also should not forget this. Creating new names and assessments and apparent truths is eventually enough to create new things. Nothing really great ever comes about if people live like that. People can live like that. But everything sort of degenerates into a kind of clever animal existence. And Nietzsche's hope is that this sort of ethic that he preaches will bring this about by, in a sense, dissolving, first of all, the rotted remnants of our present civilization, which has lost its God and that therefore is on its last legs. It's only a matter of time. So on the one hand, it will act as an agent of dissolution, but on the other hand, for those few who really are strong and free spirits, will act as a kind of encouragement for them to create new orders and new values and impose them upon everybody else. And Nietzsche is extremely frank about that. Order is imposed from above. Well, let's flip back a couple pages to 229. What does your conscience say? You shall become who you are. Now that's a very peculiar claim. For Nietzsche, it doesn't make any sense, because who you are is nobody before you become. So it's not like there's first a self that then is actualized, so there's no who before becoming. And this is the strange paradox with Nietzsche. He uses this language of self-actualization from the Greeks, but at the same time he takes out the objective core to it and gives it a purely poetic, purely 100% creative meaning. The self is created, not actualized. It's like a poem or a piece of sculpture, not like a plant or an animal that grows over time. He says, I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. In this way, I will become one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati, love of fate. Let that be my love from now on. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers. Let looking away be my only negation. And all in all, to sum it up, someday I want to be only a yes-sayer. Loving one's fate, in a sense, means trying to take everything that fate gives you as an opportunity, rather than as a debility. And that is the hallmark of the people who benefit from the death of God rather than are destroyed by it. If you want to look at the top of 234, he talks about these kinds of strong natures. About 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down, he says, "In fact, when we hear the news that the old God is dead, we philosophers and free spirits feel as we were struck by the rays of a new dawn. At this news, our heart overflows with thankfulness, wonder, presentiment, expectation. At last the horizon appears free to us again. The horizon's been wiped away, meaning that, we can go anywhere and do anything. It's a source of possibilities for some. At last our ships may set out again, set out towards every danger. Every daring act of the knower is allowed again. Our sea, our sea lies open there again. Maybe there was never before such an open sea." He's treating this as, at least for some, the free spirits, an enormous gift, a gift of possibilities for new creations. But what's to be created? New values. And what are values? Well, they're gods, in a sense. Personified, they become gods. And what do? Well, they're the foundations for new civilizations, new cultures, new orders of things, in which the masses of people will have to be reincorporated as less free, less self-conscious, more stable stones, who attain their worth by submitting to the discipline of culture. Now, I tend to think that there's a lot of truth to this, and that human worth is precisely connected with, in some ways, submitting to an external discipline or order of culture. For Aristotle, even the people at the top are submitted to this order, in some sense. Whereas for Nietzsche, the people at the top aren't really subject to anything. There's no prior order that they look to. They simply create out of their own inner resources. Okay, so they're not governed by anything outside themselves. Now let's look at this passage, 232, at the center of that page. Let us confine ourselves then to purifying our opinions and valuations and to creating our own new tables of goods. But we no longer want to brood over the moral value of our actions. Yes, my friends, as regarding all the moral blather of some people about others, it's time to feel sick. Sitting in moral judgment should be contrary to our taste. Now, the we here is the we free spirits. We few. And believe me, very few people ever read Nietzsche in his lifetime. So it always has an air of confidence, Let's leave this blather and this bad taste to those who have nothing else to do except drag the past a bit farther through time. This is what people are doing, just dragging the heavy, dead shell of their civilization forward a few more weak steps. Let's leave off on that. We don't need to drag this heavy weight behind us anymore. It's dead weight. In other words, the many, the majority, let's leave it to them. We, however, want to become who we are. Use that strange use of that phrase. And who are we? Well, we aren't anything to begin with. The new, the unique, the incomparable, those who give themselves the law, those who create themselves.